"I want a child with you," said the cowboy to the Apache woman at sunset. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the desert in shades of orange, pink, and gold. The wide-open plains seemed endless, stretching farther than the eye could see, with only the occasional cactus or rocky outcrop breaking the horizon. A soft wind swept across the land, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant hint of a river. It was the kind of place where time felt slower, where the world seemed to hold its breath for a moment before the night arrived. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. He rode with a steady, calm rhythm, the horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as they moved across the dry earth. The rider was a cowboy named Jackson. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a weathered face that told stories of years spent on the trail. His hat shaded his eyes, but his gaze was steady and thoughtful, scanning the landscape as if he was both looking for something and running from something else. There was a quiet strength in him, a patience that came from years of solitude. Jackson had been traveling for months, moving from one small town to another, following trails that few others dared to take. He was searching for something he couldn't quite name, a sense of belonging, perhaps, or a place where he could lay down roots. The trail had been long and lonely, filled with nights spent under the stars and mornings that began with the cold bite of desert air. He had seen more sunsets than he could count, each one beautiful in its own way, yet none of them had ever felt like home. Nearby, along the banks of a narrow river that cut through the desert, a woman moved with quiet grace. Her name was Ahioka, and she was a member of the Apache people. She walked barefoot along the soft sand, her hands gently brushing the herbs and flowers that grew near the water's edge. Her dark hair shone in the sunlight, falling in waves over her shoulders, and her eyes held a depth that seemed to capture the wisdom of her ancestors. She had a strong connection to the land, to the river that sustained her, and the plants that had been used for generations for medicine and food. Ahioka noticed the approaching rider before he even arrived at the river. Something in the way he moved, the calm rhythm of his horse, caught her attention. She stepped back slightly, her instincts telling her to watch from a safe distance. The Apache had long learned the ways of the land, to respect it, to read it, and to protect themselves from strangers. Yet, there was no fear in her eyes, only curiosity. She tilted her head slightly, observing the man who had come into her world without warning. Jackson guided his horse to the river, carefully lowering it to drink from the clear, cool water. He had been traveling long enough that even this small moment of rest felt precious. As he knelt beside the river, he noticed the woman standing at a distance. He froze for a moment, unsure if he should speak or simply acknowledge her with a nod. There was something about her presence that felt different from the other people he had met on his travels. She moved with a quiet confidence, not afraid of him, but not inviting him either. After a moment he spoke softly, his voice carrying gently over the water. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat slightly. The word felt almost too simple for the weight of the moment, but it was all he could manage. Ahioka's lips curved in the slightest of smiles, and she inclined her head in return. She did not speak, but the gesture was enough to communicate that she had noticed him, that she acknowledged his presence. For a while, neither of them said anything. Jackson watched the horse drink, listening to the soft sound of water trickling over stones, while Ahioka observed him from the shade of a nearby tree. There was a strange, unspoken connection forming in that quiet space, a meeting of two lives that had been moving separately until now. It was not yet friendship, not yet trust, but a sense that something important had begun. Jackson finished giving water to his horse and stood, brushing the dust from his pants. "Beautiful place," he said, more to himself than to her. The words carried across the river, and Ahioka nodded slightly. She had always known the river to be beautiful, but hearing someone else appreciate it in the same way made her feel a little less alone. Her people had lived here for generations, but it was rare to meet a traveler who seemed to understand the quiet wonder of the land rather than just its usefulness or danger. Curiosity overcame caution. Ahioka moved a few steps closer, her movements deliberate and careful. Jackson noticed her approach and gave a small, welcoming nod. He did not speak, giving her the choice to continue or turn back. There was respect in his silence, a patience that mirrored her own. Slowly they began to converse, not in long sentences but in shared observations about the river, the plants, and the changing colors of the sky. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert, they found themselves talking more easily. Jackson shared stories of his travels, of towns he had passed through, of sunsets and storms, and of nights spent alone under the stars. Ahioka spoke of her people, the traditions that guided them, and the way the land shaped every part of their lives. Neither story was complete. Each left room for questions, for curiosity, for the possibility of deeper understanding. The light of the sunset grew softer, turning the world into shades of pink and gold. Jackson and Ahioka stood together at the riverbank, their conversation growing quieter, more reflective. There was a shared sense of peace in the moment, a rare pause in lives that were usually filled with movement and responsibility. For the first time in a long while, Jackson felt a strange sense of stillness, not the boredom of waiting, but the calm of finding someone who could understand even without words. Ahioka felt something similar. She had always valued her independence and connection to her people, yet she sensed in Jackson a kind of honesty and openness that was rare. He did not try to impress her or demand attention. He simply existed in the moment with her, acknowledging her presence without needing to change it. The sunset seemed to glow a little brighter, reflecting the quiet recognition of two souls meeting in the vastness of the desert. As the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, Jackson realized that he did not want to leave immediately. There was a pull he could not explain, a feeling that this encounter was different from any he had experienced before. Ahioka, too, felt a reluctant longing. She did not speak it aloud, but she sensed that this meeting, brief as it might seem, was the beginning of something that could change both of their lives. The river shimmered in the last light of the day, reflecting the colors of the sunset and the faint outline of the two figures standing at its edge. Jackson and Ahioka shared a silent moment, the kind that does not require words but communicates everything important. The world seemed to pause around them, holding its breath as if acknowledging that something rare and delicate had begun. Finally, Jackson spoke again, his voice soft and sincere. "Maybe we'll meet again," he said, not as a question but as a quiet hope. Ahioka nodded, her eyes reflecting the last rays of the sun. There was no promise yet, no certainty, only the fragile possibility of what could come. And in that moment, under the vast sky and beside the river that had witnessed countless generations, something important began. A connection, fragile and new, between a cowboy and an Apache woman, under the glow of a desert sunset. As night fell, Jackson mounted his horse and rode slowly along the path he had come, glancing back only once. Ahioka remained by the river, watching the dust cloud settle behind him. Their meeting had been brief, yet it lingered in both of their hearts, a memory of a day when two worlds touched, when two lives seemed to find a quiet harmony in the midst of the vast, endless desert. Neither of them could predict what the future held, but the memory of that first encounter, the first shared glance, the first shared words, the first sense of connection, would remain with them forever. And as the stars spread across the night sky, both Jackson and Ahioka felt a small, unspoken hope that life had more in store than either had imagined. After their first encounter by the river, Jackson could not stop thinking about Ahioka. Her quiet presence, the way she moved with such ease and confidence, lingered in his mind like the soft glow of the sunset he had seen the night before. Even as he rode through the dusty trails of the frontier, passing towns and lonely homesteads, he found his thoughts drifting back to her, wondering what she was doing, whether the river still held the same calm beauty he had seen with her there. Ahioka, too, found herself thinking of Jackson. She had always valued her independence and solitude, yet she could not deny the curiosity he had sparked in her. He was different from the travelers who passed through her land, different from those who only saw the desert as a challenge or a resource. Jackson had seemed to notice the small things, the shimmer of the river, the smell of the desert sage, the patterns of the clouds at sunset. That kind of attention, the kind that came without judgment, was rare. The following days, their paths began to cross more often, almost by chance, as if the desert itself guided them together. Jackson would follow the trails near the river, sometimes pausing to tend to his horse, sometimes just walking along the banks to stretch his legs. And Ahioka, collecting herbs and checking on the small animals that lived near the river, would notice him from a distance. At first they exchanged only brief nods or shy smiles, careful not to impose, careful not to seem too eager. Slowly, their interactions grew longer. Jackson learned to approach her gently, speaking softly and with respect. "The river seems brighter today," he said one morning, his voice low and calm. Ahioka glanced up from the herbs she was gathering and smiled faintly. "It has been like this for generations," she replied, her voice melodic and steady, carrying the knowledge of her people. Jackson nodded, sensing there was more in her words than a simple statement of fact. He wanted to understand, but he also knew that understanding would take time. Days turned into weeks, and a rhythm developed between them. They met at the river at different times, each quietly observing the other, each learning the small details of the other's life. Jackson began to notice the patterns in Ahioka's movements, the way she brushed the leaves aside before picking herbs, the careful way she examined the water for signs of fish, the way she hummed softly to herself while walking barefoot along the sand. He began to admire not just her beauty, but her patience, her connection to the land, and the way she carried herself with dignity. Ahioka, in turn, began to notice Jackson's habits. He always made sure his horse had enough water and food before thinking of himself. He watched the sky, checking the clouds and the wind, not just for himself but for the safety of his animal. She saw how he listened more than he spoke, how he seemed to notice the smallest details around him. There was care in his actions, a gentleness that few men of the frontier displayed. And slowly she found herself wanting to know more about him, not just the stories he shared, but the man behind them. One afternoon, the sun was warm and the sky was a clear, pale blue. Jackson arrived at the river to find Ahioka sitting on a flat rock, carefully arranging herbs in a small basket. He dismounted, tying his horse nearby, and greeted her with a soft, "Good afternoon." Ahioka looked up, her dark eyes meeting his, and smiled faintly. "Good afternoon," she replied. She did not move, but there was a sense of invitation in her quiet presence. Jackson settled on a nearby rock, careful to give her space, and they began to speak. Their conversation started slowly, with small observations about the river, the weather, and the plants around them. But as minutes passed, they found themselves sharing more stories of their past, of places they had seen, and of experiences that had shaped them. Jackson spoke of lonely nights under the stars, of trails that seemed endless, and of towns that welcomed him briefly before he moved on. Ahioka shared stories of her people, of the traditions she held dear, and of the lessons her elders had taught her. With each story, they discovered small similarities. Both had known loss and solitude. Both had learned to survive in a world that often seemed indifferent to their presence. Both had developed patience, understanding, and respect for life in all its forms. And slowly, a bond formed, not one of romance yet, but of mutual respect and curiosity, of the quiet recognition that they were not as alone as they had once believed. Even the silences between them began to feel comfortable. Jackson would watch the river flow. Ahioka would trace patterns in the sand, and neither felt the need to fill the space with unnecessary words. Sometimes a laugh would escape, a shared joke about the stubbornness of Jackson's horse, or a story about a bird that refused to leave Ahioka's favorite tree. These moments, small and ordinary, began to feel extraordinary, a reminder that life had moments of connection even in the midst of isolation. Jackson also began to learn from Ahioka in subtle ways. He watched how she moved with purpose, how she respected every living thing around her, and how she understood the language of the land. He began to see the desert not just as a place to travel through, but as a living, breathing entity with its own rules and beauty. And Ahioka, watching Jackson, realized that there was strength in gentleness, that one could be brave and strong without being loud or forceful. As the days passed, they began to anticipate each other's presence. Jackson would sometimes arrive at the river a little earlier than necessary, hoping to catch a glimpse of her before she noticed him. Ahioka, too, found herself walking closer to the riverbank, hoping to see the man who had become a quiet presence in her life. There was a subtle dance between them, a careful balance of curiosity, respect, and growing fondness. One evening, the sky was ablaze with color as the sun prepared to set. Jackson and Ahioka sat on opposite banks of the river, watching the water reflect the brilliant oranges and pinks of the sky. For the first time, Jackson spoke about his dreams, about the desire to find a place to call home, and about the hope that life might offer more than endless wandering. Ahioka listened, her eyes thoughtful, and she shared her own hopes for her people, for the land, and for a life that balanced tradition with the possibility of change. In that moment, the river seemed to hold their stories, carrying them downstream like a silent witness to their growing connection. Neither needed to rush the conversation, neither needed to force feelings that were already developing naturally. There was a quiet joy in simply being together, in understanding that two very different lives could find harmony in shared space and shared time. Night began to fall, and the stars appeared one by one, twinkling above the vast desert sky. Jackson mounted his horse, and Ahioka remained by the river, her thoughts filled with the day's moments. Both felt a sense of anticipation, a sense that their lives were beginning to intersect in meaningful ways. They did not yet know where this connection would lead, but the foundation of trust, curiosity, and mutual respect had been laid. And as they parted that evening, a quiet understanding lingered in the air. Jackson looked back at Ahioka, and she gave a small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that this bond, fragile and new, was growing stronger with each passing day. The desert, vast and unchanging, seemed to recognize the significance of their meetings. It was as if the land itself was weaving their lives together, thread by thread, in the quiet, patient way it had done for generations. In the following days, the pattern continued. They met more often, sometimes sharing simple meals by the river, sometimes walking along the banks in silence. Each encounter strengthened their bond, creating a tapestry of shared moments that neither could ignore. Jackson began to feel a sense of belonging he had never known, and Ahioka felt a quiet joy in discovering that the world held surprises beyond what she had imagined. Slowly, unspoken feelings began to grow. Jackson realized he felt protective of Ahioka, wanting to ensure her safety and happiness. Ahioka began to feel a warmth in Jackson's presence, a comfort that went beyond friendship. Neither rushed these feelings, understanding that trust and love must grow naturally, nurtured by patience, respect, and shared experience. By the time the sun set again over the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, Jackson and Ahioka had formed a bond that felt timeless. They had begun to understand each other, not just through words, but through shared experiences, quiet gestures, and the simple act of being present together. And though neither could see the future clearly, both felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that life, even in the vast, lonely desert, had the power to bring people together in unexpected, meaningful ways. The days had grown warmer, and the desert seemed to glow with life under the bright sun. Jackson and Ahioka continued to meet at the river, their bond deepening with each passing day. They shared stories, laughter, and quiet moments of understanding, yet both felt that there was something more, something important left unsaid between them. The connection they shared had grown beyond friendship, though neither had yet named it. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, the sky transformed into a canvas of fiery oranges and deep purples. The desert shimmered with golden light, and the river reflected the colors with a gentle shimmer that made the world feel almost magical. Jackson approached the riverbank slowly, his horse moving at an easy pace. He had been thinking about this day for a long time, rehearsing what he wanted to say, yet he knew that words might not capture the depth of his feelings. Ahioka was already there, sitting on a flat rock, her hands busy arranging small bundles of herbs she had gathered earlier. She looked up as Jackson arrived, her dark eyes meeting his. There was a warmth in her gaze that made Jackson's heart beat faster. He dismounted carefully, patting his horse gently, and walked toward her. "Good evening," he said softly, his voice carrying a mix of nervousness and sincerity. "Good evening," Ahioka replied, her voice calm but attentive. She noticed the way Jackson hesitated, the slight tension in his shoulders, and she sensed that something important was about to be said. She remained seated on the rock, waiting patiently, giving him space to find the right words. The wind rustled through the trees nearby, carrying the soft scent of wildflowers and the fresh, earthy smell of the river. It was as if the desert itself held its breath, waiting for the moment to unfold. Jackson sat on a rock a few feet away from her, careful not to invade her space. He looked out at the river for a moment, drawing in a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Ahioka," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I've met many people in my travels. I've seen towns, rivers, mountains, and sunsets that could take your breath away, but none of it has felt as real as these moments with you." Ahioka's hands paused in their work, and she looked at him intently. She did not interrupt, but she gave him her full attention. There was a calm strength in her silence, a quiet invitation for him to continue. Jackson took another breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "I've spent so long moving from place to place, searching for something I couldn't name. I thought it was freedom, I thought it was adventure, but I realize now that what I've been searching for is connection. And I think I've found it with you." The words hung in the air, blending with the colors of the sunset and the soft flow of the river. Ahioka felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had sensed this connection growing, but hearing Jackson speak of it aloud made it real in a way that surprised her. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the truth in his voice, and she knew that this moment would change everything between them. Jackson continued, his voice growing firmer as he spoke from his heart. "Ahioka, I want more than these fleeting moments. I want to share my life with you, even if it's just small pieces at a time. I want to be here when the river flows, when the sun rises, and when the stars appear at night. And I want a child with you." The words surprised Ahioka, yet they did not startle her. Instead, she felt a deep, quiet emotion rising within her, a mixture of awe, hope, and a sense of responsibility. She understood the weight of what Jackson was saying. To bring a child into the world was not a decision to be made lightly, especially in a life as unpredictable as theirs. Yet she also felt the honesty in his declaration, the clarity of his intentions, and the depth of his care. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply watched the sun dip closer to the horizon, painting the river and the desert in deep shades of red and gold. The river mirrored the sky, flowing calmly as if carrying their emotions downstream, and the world felt suspended in time. Jackson's hands rested loosely on his knees, and Ahioka's fingers lightly touched the herbs she had gathered, both of them grounding themselves in the moment while the enormity of the confession settled in their hearts. Finally, Ahioka spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Jackson, these words, they carry much meaning. You speak of a life together, of a child, but life is never simple. The world we live in, the paths we walk, they are not always safe or easy." "I know," Jackson replied, his voice gentle. "I have walked alone for so long. I have faced loneliness and uncertainty, but I also know that life is richer when shared. I don't expect everything to be easy, and I don't expect answers today. I only know that I cannot ignore what I feel for you, and I cannot ignore the hope that perhaps we could build something together." Ahioka nodded slowly, her dark eyes reflecting the last glow of the sun. She felt a stirring in her heart, a recognition that her feelings mirrored his in ways she had not dared to admit. She thought of the quiet mornings by the river, the laughter they had shared, and the comfort she felt in his presence. "I have felt it too," she admitted. "There is a connection between us, one that I cannot explain, but I know it is real, and perhaps together we could face the challenges that lie ahead." Jackson's heart lifted at her words. He reached out slowly, just enough for her to see his hand, not touching but offering a gesture of trust. "I do not want to rush you, Ahioka. I want us to take each step carefully, to understand each other fully before we make any promises. But I also want you to know that my heart is open to you, and that I hope we can walk this path together." Ahioka looked at his hand and then at his eyes. She saw truth there, honesty, and a desire for something meaningful. Slowly she placed her hand near his, not touching but acknowledging the gesture. In that simple act, a silent agreement passed between them. Words were no longer necessary. They both understood that their bond had grown stronger, deeper, and more real than either had expected. The sky continued to darken, stars beginning to appear one by one, twinkling over the desert like tiny beacons of hope. Jackson and Ahioka remained seated, watching the river, the sky, and each other. The confession had changed the rhythm of their lives, marking a turning point that neither could ignore. They did not speak for a long time, simply allowing the weight of the moment to settle, letting the desert hold their secrets, their hopes, and their unspoken promises. As the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the distant hills, Jackson stood slowly, extending a hand to Ahioka. "Shall we walk along the river before night fully takes over?" he asked. Ahioka rose gracefully, accepting the invitation with a quiet nod. They walked together along the riverbank, side by side, their steps slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment and the connection it brought. The night air was cool, carrying the soft sound of flowing water and the gentle rustle of leaves. They spoke in whispers, not about grand plans, but about small things: the stars overhead, the soft glow of fireflies near the river, and the way the wind felt against their skin. Even these simple conversations felt extraordinary, as if the world had shrunk to the two of them and the river that connected their lives. Jackson realized that in this quiet companionship, he had found something he had long searched for. It was not just love, but trust, respect, and a shared sense of purpose. Ahioka, too, felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that someone understood her, appreciated her, and wished to share life with her fully, without pretense or fear. Before they parted that night, Jackson spoke once more, his voice soft but unwavering. "Ahioka, whatever the future holds, I want you to know that I am here. I am willing to face the world with you, step by step, day by day. And I hope, if it is possible, that we can build a life that honors both our hearts and the land we cherish." Ahioka looked at him, her eyes glistening slightly in the moonlight. She reached out and placed her hand gently on his shoulder, a gesture of agreement, trust, and quiet hope. "We will face it together," she whispered, "step by step with patience and care, and we will see what life brings us." That night, as they parted under the blanket of stars, both felt a profound sense of change. Their bond had moved from curiosity and friendship to trust and heartfelt desire. The desert, ever silent and eternal, had witnessed the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. A chapter filled with hope, promise, and the possibility of a shared future. And as Jackson rode back to his small camp, and Ahioka settled near the river, each carried the memory of the sunset, the river, and the words spoken between them. They both knew that life would not be simple, but they also knew that the connection they had found was rare, precious, and worth every challenge that lay ahead. The days after Jackson's heartfelt confession were filled with quiet joy, yet the world around them reminded both of them that life was never simple. The desert was vast, beautiful, and harsh, just as their connection was deep, fragile, and full of promise. As they spent more time together by the river, they began to notice the subtle ways the world tested their bond. Friends and neighbors in the small frontier town whispered about Jackson's frequent trips to the river and the unusual friendship he had formed. Some looked at Ahioka with curiosity, others with suspicion, wondering why she spent so much time with a cowboy from outside their community. Jackson noticed the sideways glances when he walked through town, the quiet murmurs in stores and saloons. He had faced judgment before, but the thought of it never weighed as heavily as it did now, knowing that Ahioka's safety and reputation were also at stake. He tried not to let it bother him, reminding himself that their connection was built on truth, respect, and understanding. Still, the words and looks of others were a constant reminder that love, especially love that crossed boundaries and traditions, was never simple. Ahioka, too, faced her own challenges. Her people were careful and protective of one another, and they valued tradition deeply. While some elders recognized the purity of her heart and the honesty in Jackson's actions, others were concerned. They questioned whether a man from outside the tribe could truly understand and respect their ways. Ahioka felt the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken worry that choosing a path with Jackson could create tension or even harm her place within her community. Yet, her heart had grown quiet but strong, guided by the sense that Jackson's intentions were true. Despite these obstacles, they continued to meet at the river, finding solace in the small, shared moments that had become the foundation of their relationship. They walked together along the banks, shared meals of freshly caught fish or gathered berries, and exchanged stories of their childhoods and hopes for the future. Each encounter strengthened the trust between them. Jackson learned to move with more care, always aware of Ahioka's comfort and the traditions she respected. Ahioka learned to see Jackson's patience, kindness, and willingness to listen as more than words. They were proof of his commitment. One afternoon, the desert air was warm and still. Jackson arrived at the river to find Ahioka sitting under the shade of a large mesquite tree, braiding herbs into small bundles. The scent of wild sage filled the air, a calming fragrance that seemed to ease the tension Jackson had felt earlier in town. He dismounted quietly and approached her, careful not to disturb the peace that the river seemed to provide. "Good afternoon," he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet reassurance. "Good afternoon," Ahioka replied, glancing up and smiling faintly. Her eyes held a mixture of warmth and concern. Jackson sensed the worry in her expression and asked gently, "Is everything all right?" Ahioka sighed softly, setting the bundles of herbs aside. "It is the people," she said. "Some are unsure of our friendship, our bond. They do not yet understand you or why we spend so much time together." Jackson nodded, understanding her concern. "I know," he said. "I have felt their looks and heard their whispers. But I promise you, Ahioka, I will never do anything to harm you. I will always respect you, your people, and the land you love so deeply." Her eyes softened at his words. She knew Jackson spoke truthfully. And yet she also knew that love, no matter how honest, often came with struggles. She took a deep breath and said, "We must be patient. If we are careful, respectful, and true to ourselves, perhaps one day they will see what we see, a bond that is real, built on trust and respect." Jackson reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Then we will face this together," he said. "Whatever challenges come, we will face them side by side." And so they did. Over the following weeks, the small tests of life continued. Some townsfolk whispered unkindly when Jackson passed by, but he kept his head high, focused on the moments by the river. Ahioka faced questions from friends and elders, but she answered calmly, explaining that Jackson had proven himself trustworthy, kind, and respectful of her ways. Slowly, little by little, the tension began to ease. Not all were convinced, but both of them knew that patience and consistency were stronger than gossip or fear. Their daily routines by the river became a source of stability. Jackson taught Ahioka how to track the movement of birds, read the patterns of the clouds, and find the best herbs and roots for food and medicine. She, in turn, taught him about the deeper lessons of the land, how the river changed with the seasons, how plants could heal, and how the cycles of life were connected to patience, observation, and respect. Each lesson deepened their admiration for one another. They learned to speak without needing many words, understanding gestures, glances, and silences as easily as if they were words themselves. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky filled with shades of orange, pink, and purple, they sat together by the river, watching the water reflect the brilliant colors. Jackson noticed the tension in Ahioka's shoulders and asked gently, "Do you ever feel afraid?" Ahioka considered the question carefully. "Yes," she admitted. "There is fear sometimes. Fear that others may not understand, fear that the future is uncertain. But I also feel hope that what we share is strong enough to last through challenges." Jackson nodded, taking her hand in his once more. "I feel the same," he said. "I have faced many hardships alone, but with you, the weight seems lighter. I believe that together, we can face anything the world places in our path." The wind rustled softly through the trees, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the gentle hum of the river. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, holding its breath as if witnessing the quiet strength of their bond. Jackson and Ahioka sat in companionable silence, the struggles and doubts of the outside world momentarily forgotten. Yet life was not without its surprises. One morning, as Jackson rode toward the river, he noticed a group of men from the town gathered nearby. They watched him carefully, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Jackson slowed his horse, assessing the situation. Ahioka, who had been gathering herbs nearby, noticed the group as well. She felt a moment of apprehension, but she met Jackson's gaze and saw the determination in his eyes. Together, they remained calm, knowing that their bond and their integrity would speak louder than whispers or stares. The men approached cautiously and Jackson greeted them with a calm voice. "Good morning," he said. "We mean no trouble. We are simply enjoying the river and the day." Ahioka added softly, "The river belongs to all of us, and we wish only to respect it and each other." The men studied them for a moment, then nodded slowly. Perhaps it was Jackson's honesty, or perhaps it was Ahioka's calm presence, but their scrutiny softened. The encounter, brief as it was, reminded both of them that life would always have obstacles, yet honesty, respect, and patience could overcome suspicion and fear. As the days passed, Jackson and Ahioka continued to grow closer. They laughed together, shared meals, and learned from each other. They also began to dream together, dreams of a home by the river, of children playing in the golden light of sunset, and of a life that honored both their hearts and their connection to the land. One evening, as the sky blushed with the colors of sunset, Jackson turned to Ahioka and said quietly, "Do you ever imagine a future for us?" Ahioka looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes," she admitted. "I see a life where we face challenges together, where we learn and grow together. I see hope, laughter, and patience, and I see a bond strong enough to carry us through whatever comes." Jackson smiled, feeling the warmth of her words fill his heart. Then we will keep moving forward together, he said. We will face the world step by step with care, love, and patience. As the stars began to appear overhead, they sat together, hand in hand, knowing that their connection had grown deeper and stronger through the challenges they had faced. Life would continue to test them, but they had discovered the power of trust, respect, and love, a bond that could withstand judgment, fear, and uncertainty. The river flowed calmly beside them, reflecting the moonlight and the stars above. In that quiet moment, Jackson and Ahioka understood that life would never be without difficulties. But with each other, those difficulties became lighter, more manageable, and even meaningful. Together, they had found a strength that neither had known alone, a strength born of love, trust, and unwavering patience. As night fell, they parted with the quiet assurance that the bond they shared was unbreakable. Jackson rode back to his camp, and Ahioka returned to her home near the river, both carrying the warmth of the day and the knowledge that together they could face whatever life had in store. Their struggles had not ended, but their hearts were stronger, and their hope had never been brighter. Spring arrived in the desert with a soft whisper. The once dry landscape had begun to bloom, small wildflowers coloring the sand with shades of yellow, pink, and purple. The river ran fuller, glistening under the warm sunlight, and the wind carried the delicate scent of blossoms. It was a season of renewal, and it seemed to mirror the new life that had begun quietly between Jackson and Ahioka. Their bond, tested by challenges and strengthened by patience, now felt unshakable. Jackson rode toward the river one morning, the early sunlight glinting off the metal of his saddle and the soft sheen of his horse's coat. He had spent the night thinking about the journey that had brought him here, not just the long trails and lonely towns, but the unexpected meeting that had changed everything. Jackson's heart swelled with gratitude. He had walked alone for so long, searching for something undefined, and now he had found it, not in the vastness of the world, but in the quiet presence of one woman who had touched his life deeply. Ahioka was already at the river, moving gracefully along the banks. She paused to examine a patch of herbs, her fingers brushing lightly over the leaves. Her dark hair glowed in the sunlight, and her eyes held a quiet happiness that Jackson had not seen before. When she spotted him approaching, her lips curved into a gentle smile, and a warmth spread through him. He dismounted, patting his horse softly, and walked toward her, carrying the same reverence he had felt since their first meeting. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice carrying a sense of calm and contentment. "Good morning," Ahioka replied, her eyes meeting his with a sparkle of joy. She noticed the light in his expression, a reflection of the peace he had begun to find since they had formed their bond. There was a quiet understanding between them now, deeper than words could express, that life was not only about survival or wandering. It was about connection, hope, and the love that grew from shared experiences. They spent the morning together, walking along the river, collecting herbs and sharing laughter over small, ordinary moments. Jackson watched Ahioka as she moved with purpose and grace, appreciating the harmony she maintained with the land. Ahioka, in turn, observed Jackson, noticing the care he took with every action, the gentleness in his demeanor, and the genuine warmth that radiated from his presence. Every glance, every word, every gesture strengthened the silent understanding that their lives were now intertwined. As midday approached, they paused on a flat rock near the water, watching the river flow steadily. Jackson turned to Ahioka, his expression serious but tender. "We have faced many challenges together," he said softly, "and yet here we are. We have found a way to trust, to care, and to support each other despite the difficulties." Ahioka nodded, her eyes reflecting the sunlight. "It has not been easy," she replied, "but I would not trade these moments for anything. I have learned so much from you, Jackson, about patience, about hope, and about the strength that comes from standing together." Jackson smiled, feeling a deep sense of connection and gratitude. And I have learned from you, Ahioka. You have shown me the beauty in stillness, the value of tradition, and the power of love that is patient and understanding. I want to continue learning with you, walking beside you, and building a life together. The two sat in quiet reflection for a while, letting the rhythm of the river and the gentle warmth of the sun fill the space between them. There was no rush, no need to force the future. It was enough to be present, to know that they had each other and that their bond had grown stronger than any fear, doubt, or obstacle that life could place in their path. As spring deepened, Jackson and Ahioka began to make small plans for a future together. They spoke of a home near the river, simple and comfortable, built with care and respect for the land. They imagined gardens full of herbs and flowers, spaces where children could play safely, and places where traditions could be honored while new memories were created. Every word, every idea, strengthened their vision of a life built on love, trust, and shared purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the desert, Jackson and Ahioka walked along the river, hand in hand. The colors of the sky reflected in the water, painting the world in shades of orange, pink, and purple. Jackson paused, turning to Ahioka with a gentle smile. "I want you to know," he said softly, "that whatever comes, I am committed to you. We have already faced challenges together and we will face more, but I cannot imagine walking this path with anyone else." Ahioka looked at him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "And I am committed to you," she whispered. "We have learned to trust, to care, and to support each other. That is a bond worth protecting, worth nurturing, and worth building a life around." Their words carried weight, echoing across the river and into the desert beyond. It was not a grand declaration of wealth or power, but a quiet promise of love, respect, and partnership. They had learned that the most important foundations of a life together were honesty, patience, and unwavering support for one another. As the days turned into weeks, Ahioka began to notice changes within herself. The hope and joy she felt in Jackson's presence grew stronger each day, and she realized that her heart was ready for new beginnings. Jackson, too, felt a sense of readiness, a quiet certainty that the bond they shared could blossom into something enduring. They spoke often of the possibility of children, of the future they could create together, and of the legacy of love, understanding, and connection they wished to leave behind. One afternoon, while gathering herbs by the river, Ahioka paused to look at Jackson. "Do you ever think about what life will be like when we take the next steps?" she asked. Jackson smiled, his eyes soft and full of warmth. "I do," he replied. "I imagine a life where our days are filled with laughter, learning, and love. I imagine children running along the riverbanks, exploring the land, and growing up knowing the value of respect, patience, and care. And I imagine us growing older together, still finding joy in the simple moments, still supporting each other through every challenge." Ahioka's heart swelled at his words. She could see it, every detail, every vision, every hope becoming a possibility. "Then let us work toward that life," she said softly, "step by step, day by day. Let us honor our connection, the lessons we have learned, and the love we share. And let us build a future together that is strong, patient, and full of hope." Spring turned into early summer, and with it came new growth along the river. Flowers bloomed, the water sparkled, and the desert seemed alive with possibility. Jackson and Ahioka spent their days together, learning, laughing, and planning. They discovered the joy of cooking simple meals over a fire, of reading together under the shade of a tree, and of watching the stars reflect in the river at night. Every moment reinforced the strength of their bond and the promise of a life built on trust, respect, and love. One evening, as the sun set and the sky became a canvas of gold and violet, Jackson turned to Ahioka with a tender smile. "I know the future may not always be easy," he said, "but I know that with you, every challenge will feel lighter, every joy will feel greater, and every day will feel worth living." Ahioka smiled, reaching out to take his hand. "And I know," she replied, "that with you I am stronger, braver, and filled with hope. Together, we can create a life that honors the past, celebrates the present, and builds toward the future." As night fell, they sat together by the river, hand in hand, watching the stars appear one by one. The gentle sound of flowing water filled the silence between them, a reminder of the constancy of the world and the promise of life continuing forward. The bond they had nurtured through patience, care, and understanding had grown into something rare and beautiful, something that would endure, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The desert, vast and eternal, seemed to embrace them in its quiet way. The river carried their hopes downstream, the wind whispered encouragement through the trees, and the stars shone as witnesses to a love that had grown from trust, respect, and shared moments of joy and reflection. Jackson and Ahioka understood that life would always have uncertainties, but they had discovered a strength in each other that could withstand any challenge. And so, as the first hints of night filled the sky, they made a silent promise. Not of grand gestures or fleeting passion, but of commitment, care, and shared purpose. They would face the world together, honor the lessons of the past, nurture the joys of the present, and welcome the possibilities of the future. The love they shared was no longer fragile or new. It was enduring, patient, and filled with hope. In the days that followed, they continued to dream and plan. They imagined a home built near the river, a place where traditions were honored, where love was celebrated, and where children could grow surrounded by nature, respect, and warmth. Jackson and Ahioka's bond became the foundation for this vision, and every shared moment, every act of care, and every gentle word strengthened it further. At last, one golden evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the river in fiery shades of orange and pink, Jackson and Ahioka stood together on the riverbank. The wind carried the soft scent of blooming flowers, the river reflected the colors of the sky, and the desert seemed to hold its breath in quiet admiration. Jackson turned to Ahioka, his eyes full of warmth and hope. "No matter what comes," he said softly, "I am here. I am yours, and together we will face every day with care, love, and patience." Ahioka smiled, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. "And I am yours," she replied. "Together we will build a life filled with hope, laughter, and love. Together we will honor our bond and embrace every moment." And in that moment, as the first stars appeared overhead, Jackson and Ahioka felt the fullness of their journey. Life had tested them, challenged them, and shaped them. But through it all, they had discovered a love that was patient, enduring, and unshakable. Together, they faced the future with open hearts, ready to nurture the life and legacy they had begun to build along the banks of the river.